or Lake Champlain. And I'm a voting member.
Sheila Richford, voting member.
Sarah Downs, voting member.
I'm Lindsay White, she, her, MRBA representative and voting member. And chair.
Lauren Weston, Franklin County NRCD, she, her pronouns, voting member.
Barry Lampe, NRPC, he, him, voting member.
Beth Torpy, I'm the water quality planner for NVDA, voting member, she, her.
Julie Medina, the stormwater coordinator from Albanstown, body.
See that Ted just joined us. He's a member.
Hello.
Ted, we're just doing introductions, and I think you're one of the remaining members. You and
All right, I'm Ted Siddell, Orleans County NRCD.
and I am Dean Pierce, and I'm staff, and I'll step back to whoever wants to go next.
I'm Alaire Diamond, Vermont Land Trust voting member.
We do have a couple more. Dave.
Yeah, Dave Allerton, Town of St. Albans, Public Works.
And Jim.
I think we might have had audio issues with Jim last time.
Sorry, Jim Pease, Vermont DEC, now retired.
Thanks. And then Sarah, do you want to intro yourself? I think we've got everybody but Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm the Eco AmeriCorps service member at NRPC.
Great. Thanks, everybody. As Dean noted in his announcement email, we've got a pretty hefty agenda. So I'm going to try to move us through some of our sort of standard stuff pretty quickly. We've got our welcomes and intros done, our meeting protocols. Please try to keep your camera on if possible. We're a pretty informal group, but feel free to use the raise hand function. I'll be watching the chat as well. And this is being recorded. I will read the chat out loud so everyone can participate. Are there any conflicts of interest to declare today? I'm not doing any voting, so be surprised, but this is our moment to declare yourself. And I think similarly, oh, maybe I'm going out of order. Yeah, sorry. Here's our agenda. Thanks, Dean. So any adjustments to the agenda? Hearing none. I don't think we have to vote to approve, so we'll just move on to the minutes from last meeting. Thanks for sending those out, Dean. I hope folks got a chance to look at them. We will, as long as someone who's read it wants to move to accept, we will take that motion. Or if there's any comments or discussion, sorry, any clarification.
If you just do this. Yeah.
We're seating, is that a motion, Jim? Motion to approve, or is that a question?
Yeah, sorry, I just conflict of interest. I am a subcontractor for Watershed Consulting, which is working up in Quebec. So I don't know if that's a conflict, but I just thought I'd mention it. No.
Great, thanks, Jim. Yeah, we aren't voting on any projects today, so I don't think we have to declare that, but it's great to know. And in our February meeting, we'll definitely need to declare our conflicts. So thank you. Any comments on the the minutes, or does someone want to move to accept them? Or do people need a moment to read over them?
Move to accept the meetings as written.
Okay, that's a motion from Dan. I see a hand
Well-
up. Bridget or Kent, is that a comment or a second?
That's a second from me.
Okay, thanks, Kent. Second from Kent. So we have a motion to accept from Dan, a second from Kent. Voting members, all in favor, please indicate by raising your hand virtually or physically. I see Lindsay, Sarah, Barry, Lauren, Kent, Beth, and Alaire, and Dave, and Julie. Okay, so thank you guys. We will accept the minutes from the last meeting. Is there any public comment not related to items on the agenda?
If I may, is Karen here? Karen Bates? She had sent me an email earlier with some suggested comments, and I don't, I'm still digesting them, but I just wanted to make sure if she was here that she might want to say a few words. If she's not, then I think we can continue.
Yeah, she's not among our participants list right
Okay.
now. So this is an as-needed placeholder on our agenda. Are there any new reps or alternates needed to be seated during this brand new meeting, brand new year?
I just want to say that I apologize for some confusion on my part. I'm trying to confirm that Bridget has been seated as an alternate, and it may just be that I needed to update the list, but there's no need for her to act as an alternate, but maybe someone can remind me if she was seated previously. I don't think so. And I think I still need an email. But in any event, it's possible that at the next meeting, there will be a formal seating of Bridget unless we've already done it. And again, I apologize because I don't find the documents indicating that that happened.
There was some email discussion about it, but I'm not sure it ever went to a full vote.
And if I've had something from Lynn Munna, which I don't believe I've had, that says that the watershed groups support it, then I would say everything is in order. But this may just be one of those times where the process that's imposed on us is a little bit more cumbersome, and we'll have to address it at the next meeting. We have 9 voting members present, so the need for alternates is not an issue for us. And of course, we let alternates speak, or everyone speak as much as they want, basically. So it's not going to pose a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had talked, Bridget, you had talked about replacing Tom, correct? Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
we know that Bridget is in line to replace Tom as alternate. And it's just that the way that the rule's written, it says that the sector is responsible for presenting who the alternates would be. And so that's the part of it that makes it complicated, rather than just saying to the organization that, like going to Ken and friends and saying, you want to switch Tom for Bridget? Is that, it's more than that, unfortunately.
Right.
So with that in mind, I would say we can just continue on unless there's any concern on the part of anyone.
Speak now if you have a concern. I don't, as Dean pointed out, it's not an issue today. We have plenty of voting members here, but otherwise we'll follow the process for next meeting. Great. Moving on, Dean, I'm going to just kick this over to you, the policy on budget adjustment.
Sure. And I should have started by wishing everyone a happy new year. So happy new year, everyone. And maybe we'll get some snow. For some of us, it's been pretty spare. And this will be a meeting where unfortunately I'm talking more than I would like. And it's beginning with this agenda item, which is carried over from a previous meeting when the group was presented with a possible policy on budget adjustments. The idea is that the basin councils must approve funds before the QUISP can give those funds to any organization or itself to spend on a project. And at least one of the basin councils has created a policy for simplifying that process, basically saying where if it's a minor adjustment up to 10%, it can be approved administratively. Between 10 and 20%, it is approved or approvable with staff and the chair and vice chair, or replacements in the event that the chair or vice chair have a conflict. But then over 20%, it would require a vote of the full council, like is currently the case. I included a memo in your packets and also included a series of alternatives. But as I just said previously, up to 10% staff, between 10 and 20 staff and chair and vice chair or book members, and 20% and over. The alternatives that I've shared with you and that I'm hoping the group can discuss after I finish talking are described on the slide that you should see here. The first one basically incorporates caps. So it says that it's like the original idea, but it says, yeah, it's a percentage, but as long as it's not a lot of money. And so the caps of 10,000 and 20,000 were proposed. And then there are some versions that make things slightly more complicated by dividing the, creating more categories, basically. And in the second alternative, it splits apart early stage projects and later stage projects, and it still uses caps, but it makes the caps a little bit smaller for the early stage projects, recognizing that they tend to cost less. And then there's a third category that takes this idea further and says that when it comes to later stage projects, because they can cost more, there is possibly the need for different caps. Hopefully people were able to understand what I had submitted. I've given you the material in a few different formats. Hopefully something stuck. This is a version where you can see everything on one page, and I'm going to leave that on the screen or bring it back to the screen if people would like it. But at this point, I'm essentially interested in hearing from the council. We are looking for the council to adopt a policy that would formalize this if it continues to think it's an idea worth considering. And then by adopting that policy, it would guide decision-making and then also apply to the projects that have been approved thus far, so that we do not need to come to the council unless it's one of those types of budget requests that actually require council activity. I'm seeing that there's a comment. Okay, no, that's something else. So I think, well, and I had said the questions, is it still a good idea? Which approach is preferred? And if you have a preference, what would be the next step? I have presented these and it's really just the nubs of the idea rather than in a policy format. We did that for the first time, but we can share those if that's something that you have consensus, you know what it is, what you want to do, but you don't want to vote on it as a policy until you see it as a policy. We can do that. So are there any questions, or would someone just like to kick off the discussion? I see Ted raising his hand. So Lindsay, maybe you want to call on Ted.
Yeah, I think this is a really good idea, Dean. We've already experienced some of these issues in the Memphremagog QUISP, where projects can balloon unexpectedly. Example was MWA had a project, a stormwater project, where they encountered contaminated soils after siting and everything, and then they got in and they basically found a buried building that was burnt down and shoved into a hole right where on the marina. Costs started to balloon because you had to dispose of that to keep the project going. I like the phased approach because things show you can have a well-intentioned budget and things, inflation or whatnot. There's always these creepy things that come up, and I like the kind of three levels because you're right. Project development don't cost a lot, but once you get into design and implementation, the surprises there are hefty. And so those are my comments. I like this approach. I'm looking at alternative, what was the last one, the one that's alternative 3, that's a bit complicated, but to me represents a lot of the realities going on.
Great, thanks, Ted. Kent or Bridget?
You would mute?
Yep, you're unmuted.
Okay, so my comment would be on the amounts of the caps and in relationship to the historical assessments, because I think that is what is going to necessitate coming back for these amendments in many cases. I know that is the reason for the one in Basin 5. If we are, if you make it through that historical assessment with, you know, just a simple review and a thumbs up, that's probably only going to add 2,000 or 3,000. So that would be, you know, the limits that are in there now would certainly work for that. However, we've had the great fortune of having a phase 1 assessment assigned to a couple of our projects, and I'm looking at anywhere from a $12,000 to $22,000 increase in the project cost. So I'm wondering if the cap numbers, if they should somehow reflect those HS or those HA assessments more specifically to, you know, if we get, you know, a phase 1 assessment, and then where will we anticipate that's going to happen? Will that just be, if it's just for implementation grants, well then maybe that would be addressed in the third alternate. But if it is, if those are going to be required in the design portions of the grants, maybe we need to beef up those caps a little bit to accommodate that.
So just to reflect back what I'm hearing, Ken, if something like alternative 3 is the direction people are going in, then perhaps the numbers and the caps in the first part, assessment ID, since the requirement for some fairly expensive archaeological work has been asked of you as part of an assessment ID project, and that could run as much as 20,000, perhaps. If that 5,000 and 10,000 figures could be increased so that it would be possible to get an amendment for a project like yours. Let's say it cost 19,999. If it was 20,000, it would be approvable by the chair and vice chair. So this is, I guess what I think you're saying is that maybe change it from 10,000 to 20,000 at this middle level, if people can see my, or maybe change the 5 to 10 and the 10 to 20.
Mm.
And then I don't know if there's this feeling that 20 or higher should also be increased, which ripples with the other types of projects, or maybe there isn't the need to distinguish the cap size.
Well, it's all dependent upon when you do the assessment and where we're going to be required to do these assessments. So if they're being required before we get into the implementation phase, then yes, I agree. That's where those caps, I think that's what we're talking about. I think that's the most likely reason for these amendments now.
Other thoughts? Anyone else want to weigh in on either one of the other alternatives, or, I mean, we've been discussing alternative 3. Ted spoke out about how that makes sense. I agree with Ted. I think it makes sense, but I'd love to hear from other folks if.
Well, I wanted to confirm what Ted said too, because it's really not cool for a nonprofit to be left holding the bag for a project that they started, as a result of a grant to the state. And I know that MWA is now paying Casella for disposal of the waste, and which, they clearly cannot afford, but they're also having to pay interest because they're not interest or a penalty because they're not able to pay the amount every month for the disposal of the waste. So whatever we need to do to prevent that from happening to another nonprofit who's just trying to do the right thing.
Thanks, Beth.
I think that it's really important that we up the cap, because time is of the essence. If it has to come back to us to vote, it's going to slow things down. And then, as Beth said, it puts these nonprofits in a really difficult position. And with the cost of everything, I think some of the numbers are unrealistic when we have a low cap.
And it may be helpful for the group, just as far as making progress on this, if alternative 3 had all of the caps doubled. Every place there's a cap, if the number was doubled, is that acceptable? So it would be something that staff could approve. It was up to 10,000, and the staff with the chair and the vice chair could approve up to 20, but then it would be basically, if all of the caps were doubled, would that satisfy people, or would that result in caps that are too high?
Well, I think
Can I ask can we make this chart bigger? Because the text is so small. There we go. That's super helpful. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt whoever jumped in there.
Oh, no, that was me. And I was saying, but I think the time frame is important on this too, because so maybe the 20,000 would be okay for an initial approval, but we'd have to be able to move quickly. I'm pretty sure, and Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the original cost for the disposal, the additional money for the disposal was $160,000. And so, yeah, the 20,000 would help at the beginning, but where does that lie? Like, would they be able to get the additional money relatively quickly so you wouldn't get into a penalty or paying interest phase?
Yeah, I actually don't remember the exact cost. I remember for some reason 40,000 sticks out in my mind as
well. The original was around 160.
Oh yeah, you're right. The original project was around 160.
And then Casella reduced it.
Yep, and then they were stuck with holding the bag on 35,000 or so. Maybe.
So I think timing is a sensitive issue on this.
Yeah.
As long as the organization can get the money before they need to go into some kind of a penalty situation. So is 20,000 enough to get started out? I don't know the answer to that. I'm asking you guys.
So what are you saying, Beth? Are you saying that I guess I'm looking at the sheet here, alternative 3, and thinking which one is, there's a few 20,000s in here.
Right, exactly. Good point, Ted.
And okay. So if you were looking at under 150, you got that 20,000, 20% and up. So would required action by the full BWIC be, do you have enough voting members to get in the door fast if this is exactly the situation we had in Newport?
Well,
we have a smaller group in the Memphremagog than we do here.
Yeah, I mean, the rules of the game are that the council needs to vote on funding for projects, and this idea of a policy is something that one council thought, let's try this, and DEC has said it's okay. So we're proposing that our councils do it. I suppose if the numbers got to be really, really large, then DEC might express some discomfort, but I don't think they're going to step into this as long as the councils have said, hey, this is our policy. So just for everybody's, just so that everyone is understanding, because you sit on the council in the Memphremagog, you have, and Beth is familiar with this too, you have a particular project that is a real world example, and it is an implementation project, I'm understanding, is that correct?
Correct.
And it costs more than $150,000. So in this rubric, if it cost more than $150,000 and you were hit with this, the way it is right now, the most help that the chair and the vice chair with the staff could provide is 30, but if everything is doubled, it would be 60. And then it would be over 60, it would have to come to the council. And then with any of these, if it doesn't qualify for the administrative relief, it has to come to the council, and the council has to vote on it at the following meeting. And as an example, the Lamoille Council had just such a situation as well. At their last meeting, they approved budget adjustments for a couple of projects that needed them for cultural resource assessment. In the future, those very same projects would be able to deal with things administratively. And that's the hope here, is that a policy can be put in place that facilitates the development projects. Only other thing I'll say right now is that it's going to take some time to learn if the policy's the right one, and it may be that it's going to be amended. So perhaps don't let perfect be the enemy of the good if people think there can be a consensus reached on a good starting point, and then it can always be revisited.
Yeah, this is a great starting point, Dean.
It is, and I think doubling it will work, because that will get the ball moving, and if there'll be at least some money to put down, and by the time the next council meets, the other things can be dealt with. So I think that would work.
Yeah, I find this really good from, taking the example from Newport, that in the middle of implementation, yeah, those costs ballooned, and it is going to lower your in the aftermath. Once you're done, you can recalculate your phosphorus credits, which it'll come out to being, more dollars per kilograms per phosphorus. I think the part that I really like is that flexibility in the first part, the assessments and project development phase, where there is a little bit more uncertainty. You don't know when you're going to run into archaeology, or I just like this design all the way through. Looking at alternative 3, I've been somewhat mesmerized by this. Is something we need to adopt in Memphremagog.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. And yeah, I appreciate Kent bringing up the ARC stuff that you've been dealing with. So Kent, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just had one thing to add, and that I really agree with the way this conversation's going. I'm ready to approve when the motion is made. To me, it's an alternate to calling special meetings. And I would have attended a special meeting if I had known about this situation where the watershed organization was left holding the bag. I would have been happy to attend a special meeting to address that. But I think this is a good way for starting to see how we handle these situations. But we've always had that option to do a special meeting.
Yeah, I think it's good to raise those caps, especially those middle caps, so that we can move things swiftly along. If it just takes staff and the chair and the vice chair getting together, that's a lot easier than calling a special meeting and finding a time that we can get a quorum together. So I think that we've had good, strong discussion around appreciating alternative 3 with doubling each of the caps. Is there any more discussion about that, or does anyone want to put forth
One more comment.
anything about alternative 2 or alternative 1?
Nope, I'm good. Sorry.
I think this is great. I mean, not having specific experience with this type of thing, although I have experience with costs changing, the graduated piece seems fine to me, especially given the experiences you guys have described. I think I'm just so I support it. Alternative 3. I am interested in just like getting continual feedback and information about how this is working. So like, I would support just like voting for it, and then just requesting that we get like a memo or just information anytime something does change, just because I'm interested to hear kind of like how common is that, how often is this policy going to be put into place, and maybe after a year we can look at it and see if it made sense. Did any levels, numbers need to be changed, that kind of thing.
If I can just jump in response to that, I mentioned earlier the tables were to help get consensus, but originally this was put in the form of a policy. And if you will recall, in that initial form of when it was in policy format, it does say that whenever this happens, it's reported to the council. So the council isn't isolated from these decisions being made. It hears about them at the following meeting. And so that would be the case. So if there's a motion made to adopt this with doubled numbers and put it in policy format, then that policy format is going to be like the one that was done originally. And it's going to say, anytime this happens, and it hasn't happened yet in the Missisquoi Basin, knock on wood, that's we are ahead of the curve here. The council will hear about it. So there'll be ongoing reports.
Thanks, Dean. Ted, I just want to note that Jim in the chat asked if you could elucidate about the Newport Marine project, and maybe just do that in the chat if you have access. I don't want to stifle any conversation, but I think we are starting to point towards the same direction. And if anyone is willing to make a motion, I'd love to put that on the floor.
I so move
Can you state what you're moving, Beth? Sorry.
that we accept Dean's alternative 3 at the double numbers.
Great.
I second that.
Wonderful. Okay, we have Beth motioning, Sarah seconding. Is there any further discussion? Looks like Dean.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that the numbers that are doubling are the caps, not the break points for the costs. So we're not going to change the 150 line to 300. It's just the caps. Just so everyone's clear.
Great, good clarification. Any other discussion? Okay, so we have a motion on the floor. All voting members in favor of accepting alternative 3 with the caps doubled, please indicate. I'm seeing Sarah, Lindsay, Dan, Barry, Lauren, Kent, Alaire, Ted, and Dave, and Julie. I think I've got everybody. Well, thanks. That was a wonderful discussion. Appreciate that. And that takes us to the next agenda item, which also I think is Eugene.
Yes, like I said, I'm going to be talking too much. This is a request for the council to consider an adjustment to the schedule. This is the result of the new schedule for soliciting applications. Long story short, this group has been meeting every other month. There are some councils like the Basin 5 Council that are meeting more often than that. Although I believe they'll sometimes miss meetings, or they anticipate having less frequent. But the request is that we do a shift. This is like a skip. We're going to have a quick a reduced amount of time between the January meeting, if you agree, between the January meeting and the February, and then it would be every other meeting, every other month for the meetings thereafter. And that's so that the applications that are submitted in response to the current solicitation can be decided at the February meeting. So that's the request. Basically, going to meet in 1 month's time rather than 2 months' time, and then thereafter go to the every other meeting as we are currently doing. That's the request. And if there are concerns about that, then we will just need to stay the course, or we could do an alternative. But I just thought this was the easiest way to propose it. And I imagine that people have this on calendars as though it were a monthly basis, perhaps not, but that's my hope, and that it can be adjusted. That's really all I needed to say about that.
So I just want to point out that if we move to the proposed schedule, it will involve 7 meetings happening during this calendar year. I know that some folks use different funding sources to cover their time, and I just want to make sure folks know that it will be a little bit more time involved.
In this current year, yes,
yeah,
that would be the
without
case.
any of our budgets would be murdered by 2 hours, but this one. Any concerns or comments or questions about seeing all of our lovely faces on screen in a month and then following every other month thereafter? Go ahead, Ted.
Is this because we get a weird, I missed a preface, Dean. Is this because we get a weird jamming of things at the turn of the year where we have to kind of rush into things?
No, it's because there were a series of alternative schedules for soliciting applications that were proposed. The one that was considered most desirable necessitates this shift.
Oh, okay.
So it's a one-time event.
So yeah, that seems to make the most sense, to follow the shifting of the proposals and then the commenting back. Yeah, that makes sense.
And if that's okay, then I'm satisfied with that. If someone wanted to make a motion, they could, but I don't feel it's really necessary if it's agreed to.
Speak now, or we're going to make the change without consulting. Right. Hearing and seeing no concerns, move on to cost effectiveness.
Again, talking too much here. This is a topic that's on the agenda because it was raised by the technical project manager at DEC, Chris Rotler, who is working with all of the QUISs. And he had asked people in my position to talk with their councils and have the councils discuss this topic. In the packets, you had a staff memo. There is some information that we have about what projects typically have costed in the past. There's a database that was created through about 2021. That database produced some averages, and those averages were incorporated into the formula that's used to divide funding across the basins. There's been a fair bit of discussion between the between the QUISPs and DEC about the need to update those numbers. And I had just indicated to Chris that I will put this on the agenda and allow the BWIC to respond to it. The questions are, is setting some kind of threshold where if a project's going to cost more than a certain number of dollars per kilogram, that it's basically not considered. Is the idea of a threshold a good idea? If it is a good idea, what sort of threshold should there be? And if it's not, why not? In the meeting packets, I'm going to share. So I have this handier. This is a table that many of you have seen. It reflects the crunching of all of the numbers that existed at least at that time frame, late 2020 or early 2021. And as you can see, that it's possible to look at average per kilogram, dollars per kilogram cost across the sectors. The sectors are streams developed, which would include stormwater projects and roads, ag projects, and forest projects. You know, there's not as robust information for all of them, but you could crunch the numbers and see that these are the costs. And when you look at a basin by basin basis, the basins are getting money with the expectation that it will cost on average about $15,000 per kilogram. I'm overstating it a little bit, but people have recognized that those numbers were out of date, and that we've also seen a lot of project inflation in COVID era and after. So we've had some conversations in the past, or is the number really a good idea? Are there alternatives? When we look at a project, is the number the only thing that matters? Is dollars per kilogram the only thing that matters? And so we've talked about things like looking at, well, what's the percent of the target that it helps us achieve? And look at that, as well as the percent of the annual amount of money that we use. Just different ways of assessing how valuable a project would be. I also wanted people to know that we use these formulas in our ranking system, although the ranking system really has more impact when you have multiple projects than it does when you have one project. It's really more about comparing projects in a given round. Anyway, that's the question. I feel like I'm belaboring this, but I think that the central starting point could be a table like this one, which is essentially saying that the average cost per kilogram should be something like $15,000. If we start at 2020 or 2021, how much do we think it should be higher today and still be found acceptable if we even want to do that? And I think maybe it's better for me to answer questions, and I do see a couple of hands, so I'll let you take things over for now. Let's see.
Go ahead, Jim.
Dean, I would just say that I was involved with this this publication. I was the grant manager, and all I'm going to say is, yes, it's what, 2 years old now, 3 years old, but it is based on as much data as we could possibly do. A lot of money. The state spent a lot of money on this analysis, and so I don't think that at a minimum, there's 10 years of data data points for each. Most of those practices, but I think the numbers are realistic, but I would agree that they're not adjusted for inflation, and I think it does depend on the project type as to where inflation has changed things. I mean, a lot of these projects they did use the most recent data, so 2019, not 20, but 21, but prior to the pandemic inflation. So, I mean, I think it's fair to, and I don't know how you would do that, figure out the average inflation rate for, Orleans and Franklin County, whether it's the same as the states or what. I think that adjustment is certainly fair, but and I think you asked some really good questions. But I would just say that there was a lot of effort put into this process, and I think the numbers are and they were a mean. They weren't the high or the low. They were the mean. So if you're taking, you know, $100,000 project and increasing it by 10%, I mean, you're still taking the average project of 100,000. So anyway, it's that's all. I'm not gonna. That's all I'm gonna say.
Thanks, Jim. Go ahead, Ted.
Thanks for clarifying, Jim. That you answered one of my questions. And it seems that you could do a straight like 10 or 15% increase of some of the averages and probably be in the ballpark. The other question I have you seen, has anybody else seen Ben Copan's cost curves for what we've done in the Men for Magog? He had a cost curve that puts, you know, all these on a curve to look at where you get kind of inflated cost per kilogram per year versus the low end. And again, you're right, Dean, it was used to compare multiple projects if you had like 5 or 6 applicants setting in versus just one. But it's a curve that we're using in the Men for Magog, and I don't have it. I've tried looking for it, so I can't find it. Maybe Beth knows where it is. Nope, she's shaking her head. No. But Karen Freeman has it, and now Nathaniel would have it too. So it's worth looking into and maybe discussing at the next BWIC.
Yeah. If I can just quickly respond, I do want to say, acknowledge what Jim said. I was just showing on the screen a moment ago a spreadsheet file that has a lot of that data. I don't mean to downplay the amount of information data that went into the generation of the original set of numbers. It's just that there are people who are feeling like they've fallen behind, and what is the best way to react to that, and inflating them is something that a lot of people have said, but then that just raises the question. I think there are a couple of dimensions of this issue that it would be helpful for the council members to address, and one is if we look at this table and we want to understand like what's the right average cost, that's one thing. But what I had also understood DEC to wonder about is there a point of excessive cost? And so if people have thoughts on both of those things or either of those things, then yes, please share them. But I wanted to make clear that there are a couple of dimensions with this.
Go ahead, Alaire.
Yeah, I'm curious what, I don't necessarily feel like we as this council are in the right place in terms of our combined skill set or our individual skill sets to sort of decide how to value these projects with phosphorus and all of this stuff. Like, I think that just seems like it's not exactly it's not the skill set I have. And I would just wonder if it's other people think that it's something that they're capable of, like deciding whether we should do pounds or dollars and all of that. And I also just wonder, like, does it make sense for us as this particular council to even be like, do we make a decision that like a different basin makes from a different basin? Like, it feels like this is just something that should happen on a statewide level. That's a broader issue. And then I'm just wondering why we're like feeling like we have to decide something here and what we're supposed to do. Doesn't totally make sense to me.
Yeah, if I can quickly interject before Karen speaks, as mentioned, this is on the agenda because it was an ask. I too have some hesitation about the ask and what is the right role for the council, at least what's the right role without more setup or background on what DEC is actually hoping. And that's why I'm emphasizing the 2 points that are involved. And this idea of, is there an excessive cost. One of the issues that DEC, and maybe this is something Karen can address, is there are different funding programs. And the formula funds are supposed to be used in cost-effective projects for reducing phosphorus. And there are other sources that could be used for the projects that don't have that as their hallmark. And I think some of what DEC is wondering is there a point where we could say, you do a calculation and this is the grant source it goes to, and it's not formula fund because it doesn't meet the threshold? Is that as a policy issue? And I think the council members can address the policy. Would you be concerned if there was a number chosen by someone that said you're not going to see these projects because the determination has been made that due to their costs, they really should be funded somewhere else?
Karen, go ahead.
So I think too, this can be looked at very simply as just a guide that when a project comes up and the phosphorus to dollar cost is not comfortable, then you could look at this and say, well, this is really high average cost for this category. Maybe we ought to not fund it. Whereas this is the average cost for this type of project, like a stormwater project, and we need to do some stormwater, so it's okay. So I think it's just a guide. So you have a sense of comfort as to which project you're picking, because you will have to probably provide or identify and fund projects with a high phosphorus to dollar cost, because you got to find some projects in the stormwater sector you're hoping to, as we have to do everything everywhere. Although, so that's my take on this. I don't know that there has to be a policy. It's just a comfort level. But Jim, I had a question for you too. I mean, like, let's say, for example, for stormwater, within that category, there must be a range. And so it's easy to look at this and say, we're not doing stormwater. No way. It doesn't make any sense. But, you know, and I think I've suggested this elsewhere, but like in Burlington and South Burlington, they're taking a catch basin. This is the city. They're digging a pond around it that's sort of then a lowered area that's grassy. And that becomes infiltration basin without anything fancy. And I'm wondering if there is a possibility to take these categories and maybe break them out into specific project types where we can expect a lower phosphorus reduction, a phosphorus to dollar ratio, I guess. So that would have to be added on to this table, but I wonder just for the future work on this, if that's a possibility.
I'm not sure if I understand your question, Karen, but it seems like the project types are broken out in stormwater. They're not just allocated to, you know, all stormwater projects. Each individual project type is broken out by price or average price. But yeah. I don't know, this goes back to Dean's question, I guess, about, I mean, how that money is then allocated to the board to spend, and it depends on how many projects, right? Whether they're ag, forest, urban, and then you know, which project. I guess it's specific to the board's request as to how, you know, if they have projects lined up and they know they're going to do one forest planning project, one floodplain project, once, you know, they can use those numbers. I don't know, Dean, how the money is allocated. I retired before that ever became a fact, how they were going to spread the money out. But I assume it's based on the board's request, based on projects that you're proposing to do, right? And is it specific to a specific type of stormwater project, or it's just you're saying you're going to do some type of stormwater project?
So the formula funds are distributed based on the modeling. So the modeling shows the size of the phosphorus problem in the various sectors.
Right.
And the dollars, so the size of the problem in that sectors is what is driving things.
Right.
The projects, the costs are generalized by sector. So it's not like,
Right.
yeah, so it's, you know,
it's not a request, right? It's based on the
right,
target.
but it is not fine grained. The costs that are used to determine, so in the Missisquoi Basin, we have very high phosphorus reduction in the stream sector. Well, the fact that we have very high phosphorus reduction needed in the stream sector, that gets us, based on the formula, funding at the rate of $10,000, $10,601. I'm going to share this just so people know what I'm talking about. It doesn't give us anything else. It's based on the average for the sector. We have no way of knowing, you know, what's the mix of floodplain, river, riparian buster. It wasn't based on each of those individual parts. It was based on the average for the sector. Similarly, the developed sector, it's the developed average. It's the farm average and the farm sector.
Right. Okay. Well, I still go back to, I really think it's the inflation, the rate of inflation in I mean, inflation's going down now, right? So yes, it was excessive, but it is declining. Who knows what it's going to do? So, but at least for the next year, you know, the state should be paying you X amount more. I don't know how that happens anymore, but I mean, they should be increasing the amount they're giving you for a specific project. Just, I mean, there's no way to know what part of the, you know, the world is inflating more than other parts, whether it's, you know, the cost of trees, the cost of, you know, a catch basin, the cost of a cover crop. There's just no way to know. I mean, and no one's going to break it out. But we should know that the cost of inflation over the last 3 years. Yeah, you know, what's been the cost of inflation, and at a minimum, you guys should be getting that much more, I think. But I don't work for the state anymore, so I don't know what the answer is.
Well, the formula isn't changing. So for now,
so there's no proposal to adjust.
Well, that's not the same. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's just that the formula is what it is for now. It is, the process is a little bit cumbersome because law and the rule call for a specific protocol to be written, and that protocol was written at the outset, and that's what the distribution is based on. It's just that the DEC can't, you know, by simply saying, oh, okay, we're going to change the number. It's a little more involved than that because it's based on.
I understand that. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my advice would be, at least for the time being, until DEC adjusts those numbers, that you certainly look at projects that are the lowest cost, you know, in the lower cost. You know, you're given, you got to do 20% ag, 20% urban, and whatever, 60% in forest. You need to look at, in those individual practices, the lower cost projects that are listed. That would be to protect your bottom line. I think until the adjustment's made, that would be a suggestion, just because, yeah, it might take DEC a few years to adjust. And you don't, like you were saying, you don't want to get yourselves into trouble either, you know, in paying bills or you know, higher costs than expected. Because I don't think DEC, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Karen, but you're not going to get not a bonus, but an increase from your allocation. You get what you get each year. Is that correct?
I can't comment on that.
Or quarterly, you get from the state the board gets from the state a certain amount of money annually. Is that right?
So the
For the-
formula, yeah,
Yeah.
there are annual allocations that are more or less stable because of this existence of the formula. It's the pie that is included in the state budget that ultimately determines, but the manner of dividing up that pie is determined by the formula. And the formula is driven by where the needs are and what these average costs for the sectors to address those needs are. But I do want to try to pull things back if we've gotten too far into the weeds, because as I had understood, there are these two dimensions, and maybe it's enough to say that we have to be careful about overspending if we're falling behind inflation, because unless DEC is promising to make us whole, we're going to be in a deficit. That's one thing I get, but I'm just very interested in knowing if there's anybody with an opinion at all about the idea of a threshold, either in terms of what seems like the sweet spot, barring not having any other information. The averages are a good starting point, or the averages adjusted by inflation are a good starting point. But is there an upper level that people have any opinions about, or any different level that people have opinions about? And maybe we've done enough on this and can move to the next agenda item, because it's just not the thing.
Personally, I have a hard time considering a max cap, just because it seems like there's so many things we can't predict. So I don't know if anyone else has a different opinion, but it seems like it would be hard to say this is the top that we're going to apply to this type of project.
That works for me, and I'm happy to report things back to the people that were asking for this input. And if we are ready to move on, I would be happy to continue the discussion with the topic of project adoption, if the time is now. And it seems it is. Okay. In the packets, there was a brief memo, and there were some other things I have mentioned in the memo, and I think in some of the meetings, how DEC has prepared a series of chapters. They're chapters in what's called the guidance document. They are setting policy in different areas. I may need to take a sip here. And one of the chapters addresses operation and maintenance. So partner organizations are seeking funds or applying for funding to do projects. We want those projects to reduce phosphorus, but we need to make sure that those projects are maintained over time, because their performance could degrade if we don't take care of them. And so, to be fair to those that do the projects, funding is available for operation and maintenance. Excuse me. And that's a discussion for another day, which is, as we look at available funding, we're looking at reducing phosphorus and funding new projects. But at some point in the future, in theory, after we've done a lot of projects, we could shift from being in the mode of funding projects to being more concerned about how do we maintain the projects we've already funded. So that's one category or basket. But DEC has also recognized the possibility of adopting projects that have been done in recent years that don't have a financial sponsor for their operation and maintenance. Those costs are being carried elsewhere or some other way, or not being done. And DEC has said, Quis, you can adopt those projects, get the paperwork taken care of, and they can add to your bottom line of phosphorus reduction. And so we have been aware of the fact that this chapter in this guidance document was in preparation, and so we had been holding off on what we'd been holding off on any kind of presentation to you to get into the details because we weren't aware of what those details would be. And now that the document has been released, we're sharing it with you and starting the conversation in more depth about project adoption. And there is a lot of details in what is required. The thing I would say is think of adoption as really being one piece of a much larger process. That I've got this chart showing here. It's a very complex diagram that shows anything and everything having to do with operation and maintenance. And I don't think we need to concern ourselves with it. It's really just a subpart of what's going on that you do want to have some conversations with. And I've given you the text from the chapter, tried to make that in a bite-sized chunks. And I've also tried to give you the information and some graphics for people to perhaps, if you are a visual thinker, you can understand. But basically, the clean water service provider has a role to verify that projects are taken care of the way they're supposed to. So there are QISP and there are project verifiers. There are also project implementers. They're kind of who you would think they would be. There are landowners. There are the folks or whoever it is who is going to actually maintain the project. There are all these different actors who are anticipated to be part of this process. This is where the funding is going to go. There's going to be a lot of reporting. And so my hope is to give some of this information to you in a graphic way so that you could start to understand what is involved. But when it comes to project adoption, it's going to involve, first of all, finding, does anybody have a project that they're aware of that was done in the last few years that's got good phosphorus performance, that's been taken care of, where the landowner might be willing to sign an agreement that says, in exchange for your agreement to allow us to maintain it if it isn't taken care of already, we'll provide funding. And so we are going to be starting to cast the net. Who has ideas for projects that have been completed that might be candidates for adoption into the ledger, basically? I don't want to I'm hoping that people had a chance to at least scan the materials in the packet. I'm hoping you had a chance to at least glance at these graphics if they work for you a little bit better to understand how this is going to work. There's a role spelled out in the document for the Karen, the watershed planner of the basin, who can suggest candidate projects. But anyway, I wanted to get the conversation started. There are some things about the draft chapter that we as a QISP are going to provide comments to DEC on. There is, for example, a cap. If we were able to identify 100 projects that we might want to adopt, DEC is saying, no, they don't want to, they want to have a 10% of our target being achieved through adoption of projects. There are some technical details that I won't get into unless people have specific questions on them, but I'm going to stop talking and let people start asking questions about any of the materials that you've seen, and also solicit any thoughts people have about the types of projects that you as a BWIC would like to see proposed for adoption, and anything at all about that. I'm gonna stop talking and let people like Ted raise their hand.
So, I'm not letting you speak alone, Dean. I'm curious, does anybody, I've been kind of scratching my head on looking at projects that have been done in the last couple of years, what I would consider adopting. And does anybody taken the time to think about this one? because this could get expansive, and I'm glad to see that you mentioned that there was a 10%, because I guess but I don't think there's that many projects on the ground unless you're going back 5-10 years to get to that bulk. But I would love to see an example project that would fall in this category or hear of one.
Lauren.
I guess my thoughts are tree plantings that we've done through Trees for Streams DEC funding. If I am recalling correctly, you can only adopt projects that were originally funded by DEC. And so that is like, there's very few projects that we have that would even meet that criteria in general. There's also existing enhancement funds from DEC to go back to tree plantings. So I'm not sure that I would transfer that over to the Quist pool. I guess that's where I'm kind of at.
Karen, maybe you have some clarification.
Did you say Karen? So I was just going to say that it made sense to me to do something along the lines that Lauren was proposing, that one specific type of action that you just get really good at, and you have the technical assistance, or you have the technical ability. But then another area where I can say this, but I don't know that it's really going to work because you don't have the stormwater chambers, but where you need one piece of equipment that you can rent for the couple of days, and then you just go around and you clean all the projects, or maintain all the projects. And so the underground stormwater chambers, but I don't know, except for the catch basins in the Highgate school parking lot. I don't know that there are many of those. So, but generally more of a category to look for.
Kent?
Yeah, as a veteran that used ERP money and DEC funds in the past, I've got O&M agreements out there. And I've got gravel wetlands that need attention. When I was working with VTrans, in the VTrans right away on some stormwater projects, I was required to get an easement from the private landowner, from the adjoining private landowner. So I guess my question to DEC would be, considering this, are those old O&M agreements that we signed off on, is that sufficient moving ahead, or are we going to have to be getting land easements if we're going to be, if DEC will go in and provide funding for this maintenance?
If I can just, yeah, if I can jump in, there is a there's a cutoff point above which easements are required and below which they're not required, and I believe that that's at 150K, but I'm gonna get that number. But it is not necessarily a requirement, Kent, unless it exceeds the threshold cost.
150, we can live with that. I can't think of any cleanup that'll cost that much, because the original projects didn't cost that much. So that would be, yeah, we could live with that.
Right, and I think the threshold is the original project cost, where you need an easement versus access agreement. Since I have the floor, I'll just echo Lauren's semi-concern about not having a lot of state-funded projects. You know, when I first think of like project adoption, I'm like, oh goodness, it would be great to have some money to take care of the bank stabilization project that we did in 2020, but that was private funds. So tree plantings are all we have for state dollars. Right.
Yeah, and I think that, just as we were talking earlier about the policy and, you know, let's get a marker in the ground and know that we can come back and change it. I think there is an element of that in this document, because this is a conversation that did come out in some of the committee meetings that I had attended. I think the possibility of opening up project types may exist. It's one of the challenges is so much of what we're doing involves accounting. And so before opening up the eligibility to too many categories, I think this is the starting point where it will be easier to understand the implications for accounting and not double counting or things like that, because I think there's a fear on DEC's part that we don't want to say to somebody that we can take it over, but then find that part of the reason we're taking it over is compromise because no, the credit was actually somehow, even though we didn't really know it, was somehow factored in, et cetera, et cetera. But these are the kinds of policy areas that we as a quiz are commenting on with this document, because we do think there's a lot of policy that's included in the guidance document, and it's making the system, which is already pretty rigid, more rigid, and we want it to be as flexible as it can possibly be so that there's greater opportunities to take on projects rather than few. And I accept that this may need to be the starting point to get things rolling, but it should be possible, I think, in time where some of those projects where if no one has claimed it and it's there, why can't we adopt it? Or why shouldn't we adopt it? Update the policy so that it's eligible.
Well, that sounds good to me. Jim, do you want to weigh in?
Dean, I would just say, I think there were a few projects funded through the DEC post or the stormwater master plan for Enosburg. I don't know what happened with the garage. There's two garages. I think the village garage, there was a project installed there. There were some projects funded through DEC for Enosburg.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that we don't think that there aren't any projects. And yes, I had thought of the Highgate School project as one possibility. One of the Enosburg projects that you're referring to had kind of some technical issues with its implementation. I think if we're thinking about the same one, really what I wanted to present to the group were the questions that I'm showing here that weren't in the package, but I will leave them with you, which are, do the partners have any projects they would like to see adopted? If you do, based on the conversations that you've heard so far, think there might be something, let's talk. Also be thinking about how quickly you might want to move on that. Something that's going to be important, and this is where we have to navigate sensitive territory with landowners. There would need to be a verification visit to establish that the practice is in the shape that it needs to be in. So we have to get boots on the ground to check it out. And then if there isn't a landowner agreement, or if it's not going to be acceptable, then will that be a challenge? So these are just some questions for people to think about that I will ask you to consider as we go forward with this.
Actually, Dean, there were a number of stormwater projects. I'm a little out of date here, but I know Swanton had a couple of swirl separators installed, possibly a rain garden, and they also did an infiltration basin. So I think maybe, I guess I mean, maybe putting out a request to the towns, I might turn up some of these projects.
Yep. And again, we're looking, I understand that. And what we want to do is that on top of those, be aware of any projects that partners are involved in that they might want to see considered as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Lindsay,
Yeah, I'm curious if there's like how old can the projects be? Can they be 10, 15 years old or older? I know that VLT has there were a couple of like floodplain restoration projects along like in Sheldon, and there's one on the Tyler branch and one on another conserve farm in that area that predate kind of my being working at VLT and so forth. So I'm not super familiar with them, but I can imagine they might be good candidates. And they were DEC funded. I think they were like kind of run by DEC, like Stacy Pomeroy was sort of the project manager. So yeah, just curious if those would be potential projects to consider for this.
I was looking to see if this version of the chapter actually had a cutoff with age. I'm not seeing it in this section, but the thing I would say is that what determines what can happen is the design life of the practice when it was installed. And so if it's a type of practice that has a 10-year design life and we're at that point, it may be that it's going to be thought of as a new project. We would just need to do something that reinvigorates it. We'll come up with a project that becomes a vehicle for giving it a re-upping of its design life. That may be what will determine if something is well past its design life. I think that kind of approach is going to be necessary.
Jim, is your hand up a new comment or a legacy raised hand?
Oh, sorry, but well, I would just add to Dean's comment that the design lives are all in that, or they should be available to the NRPC if anybody needs to know.
Yeah, so it's not a question of knowing the design life. It's the question of it may be short enough where some of these projects are outside, and the policy does have some language addressing what DEC considers the sweet spot for adopting projects, too late in the game or earlier in the game. But that's a detail that I'm going to have to look at again before I say anything about it. But I see Karen's heads up.
So are the two-tiered ditches, if they are going to be or could be identified as formula funding eligible, that would be an interesting category as well, since it would give the farmers then another reason to implement these practices on their land. And it may not take a lot of work, as it's just maintaining or ensuring, I guess, that the plantings, that tiered area is planted and not.
We might run into the issues of ag eligibility or eligibility of ag projects that we'll be talking about shortly.
Yeah, so I think that's the only stumbling block, but otherwise, I think that would be a good project for a lot of reasons.
So Dean, you have on there next steps. So I think would next steps be for folks that think they might have a project to just reach out directly to you and start asking these questions and gathering our materials?
Yes, it would.
So I think folks just keep that in mind. It sounded like there might be a couple of project ideas. Connect with Dean and see if it's eligible, see if it works out, see if you can answer all those questions that he has up there on the screen.
Are we ready? Are we ready to move on? As I had said in the meeting packet in the memo, this was something that was put on the agenda at a suggestion of a book member who has encountered, or they're doing a project and encountering this question. We've talked about in the past how the formula fund does direct money to the QUISP and the basins that the councils can review and approve for agricultural related work, but there are limits on what that funding can go towards. And so I'm gonna make you aware of some documents if you haven't already seen them. And then people ask questions, just to put it back on the radar, because it's something that has not come up for a while yet. But basically, the Agency of Agriculture has as its domain, rather than DEC having as its domain, investment in stormwater projects on farms that are regulated. And there are some regulations that have been around in different forms for a few decades now. They're called the required agricultural practices, and there are different levels of farms. And for the majority of those, or 2 out of the 3 levels, it's a non-starter. That's it's a farm that we would not normally do a project on. Small farms are a better opportunity, but regardless of that, it still has to be a type of project that isn't agricultural. So we have to navigate that. So this is a part of a diagram that has been provided to people like me by the Agency of Agriculture that shows the process, which begins with using something called the project readiness form, which is pretty similar to the portion of the screening form that DEC has applicants use. But basically, we have this question that we answer, is it on a jurisdictional farm? And if the answer is yes, we have to be concerned. Is it a project, an agricultural project? Because if it's an agricultural project, then we're not going to be able to direct QUISP funds to it. If it's not an agricultural project, then we are in the game at least. And so there are steps people need to go through. We provide a form. Whoever wants to do this project provides the form to the Agency of Agriculture, and they would review it, sign off on whether or not it's going to be a fundable project. So this is the chart. Hopefully it's useful for people. In addition to the project readiness form, this is the form which I have provided to some people and could also provide on request. I confirmed with Agency of Ag staff that even though this is called Design Implementation Block Grant Project Screening, it's still the valid one. And you have to fill it out and submit it to them for their review. There is a particular part of that form at the end that's called Agricultural Project Review, and this is where the nuts and bolts are. And it's essentially the same information that is in that flow chart that I showed you just a second ago. Is it on a jurisdictional farm? Is it an agricultural project? You answer your questions and then you submit it, and they let you know whether or not you have done it the correct way. I think what I'll do is I'll stop and see if there are any initial questions at the moment. Ted's got a question.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's more of just a comment that I've already been through this, working on a farm up in Derby, and went through this. And what really helps is to make sure you get this form filled out earlier than after your application, because getting the response back from Department of Ag takes some time. Unless you're good at shaking and rattling cages and ringing bells. But it's not arduous. It's not too much of an extra step to go when putting all your materials together. I'd be happy to share more information about it if you want to, but I think we should move on to Lauren.
Well, I guess my question is, if you want to do a project on a farm field that is rented by a jurisdictional farm, but the owner is not a farmer, like, where are we going with that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's for the Agency of Ag to determine. I have a hunch on what they're gonna say, but yeah, they will make that call. You've got to make some assessment of whether or not it's worth your time even pursuing it. And I do find the process, although Ted is saying it's not arduous, I do find aspects of it to be a little bit chicken and the egg. You've got to provide levels of information that you may not have at an early state, and I find that's a little bit problematic. But I think that if you start a conversation with Nina Gage, you know, I found her responsive, and so I think, you know, start there.
So I guess my feedback would be I would maybe make the argument that I wouldn't even need to contact her if the owner of the land was not a farm. So we're going to start there. But then the second point is just kind of like how this came about, because this was never required on other block grants that we did on farms. And so I'm just curious why now?
So if I can just jump in, Lindsay, what I understand, this in some ways goes back to this idea of distributing funds. As I said a while ago, there's a big pot of money. That big pot of money is a result of recommendations and hearing by Clean Water Board, but it's basically, here's all the money that should be addressed to clean up, to address water quality projects. And then we have to figure out how to divide it. And there is this formula that I talked about for the non-regulatory piece. Well, I've seen references and heard mention of a memo. Someone somewhere wrote a memo that somehow assigned 10% of the agricultural problem, let's just call it an agricultural water quality problem. And it said 10% of that could be associated with the QUISP realm, QUISP and BWIC realm. And this is a long-winded wind-up to answer your question. Is that we're having this conversation because there's this small slice of eligibility for farm projects. In some ways, it would have been simpler if there was absolutely no eligibility using QUISP funds if it was a farm of any sort. But since there is, then that's what means we have to go through this process. And there's a lot of process, I guess you could say, because the Agency of Agriculture wants to make sure that you're not doing a project that really should be in there 90%.
But the Agency of Ag doesn't have money for us to do projects on farms.
I'm not saying
these kinds of projects on farms. They have money for other kinds of projects on farms, but not natural resources projects on farms.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's going to necessarily make sense, but in a perfect world, anytime it's something that is clearly a natural resource project, they should say yes, and they should say yes expeditiously. The things that concern me are about this process where it's worded in such the way that it's agricultural practices. This is not an exhaustive list of, it's not a super bright, clear line between what they're saying we could fund and what we couldn't. And so there's the human element where they have to say, yes, it's on the right side of the line. I mean, I would love to, we have so much money in the Missisquoi to fund projects. I would love to be able to fund these projects. And as long as they say it's a natural resource project, then I want to bring it to the BWIC to fund, because like you say, if you don't have other sources of funding, let's use the QUISP funds. But you need to get the agency to say that it's not out of bounds.
Erin, go ahead.
So I'm thinking that at some point soon we'll have more guidance based on the experience that Nina is having right now with the questions she's getting. Marley, and Kent's going to have some good input too, I think. I know. But Marley, when we met about the Rock River projects, was very clear that, yeah, the natural resource project, it's probably going to get funded. And even with riparian plantings, if they have already let us know that they don't want, landowner said, no, I'm not doing crap, then that might also be an option for formula grant funding, because it's the only way that it's going to get done. So natural resource restoration, we should apply. I would love to see everyone apply as much as possible so that we can, from that Nina's experience, can then develop some better guidance so that you have a better sense of what's going to be approved.
Ken?
Okay, so I'm the one that asked the question of Dean to bring this back and revise it. And the reason I asked it is because there are so many opportunities that we're being presented with. We were presented with 4 high priority projects in Basin 5. They are all associated with middle-sized farms, and they are not directly RAPs. The study that we're doing in the Rock River and that has already been done is identifying 30% designs that we want to bring to 100% design and implementation. But there is got to be a connection between the upland practices that are happening on the farm fields, and then when you get down and you get into the gully, you get into the wetland below and try to do the work down there. And what I'm seeking is, how do we navigate this? How do we get this process going? How do we start this conversation between ag and DEC, and where are the lines drawn, and what can we offer when we go into these situations? I mean, I'm thinking about some of these gullies that are going right into the rock, that are just, they're like landslide areas. And you go up on the farm field and they're using no-till, they're using cover crop, but they're not using grassed waterways. There's other things they could be doing up there. But those gully, until you start working, below that and working with that area, if I've got to wait 3 years before we address this, that's 3 years of more landslides and more sediment, within a mile of the lake. So to me, there's a sense of urgency here, and I guess I'm willing, like I really need the review of this before I start making applications. So I'm really happy to have these flow charts, and I intend to work with my consultants and our staff as we select these projects and try to come up with the right ones.
Dean?
Maybe Karen would want to weigh in on this as well. I just want people to understand that the situation Kent is talking about is one that is, it's a function of language in the funding policy that says when you're doing a project that involves a gully, then you have to look up slope. And maybe everybody's understanding that, but in case someone wasn't, it's just that you have to look at the contributing area and address that as well. And I can certainly see the potential for some conflict or complication, because it's expanding the area that you have to have your project to address. But I don't know if Karen has any thoughts on this, because I know you and I chatted about some of this not that long ago, or if anybody else wants to drop in. But it's related to a specific aspect of the funding policy that says, oh, when it's involving a gully, you got to look at the area contributing, and that of course makes things more complicated.
Yeah, definitely. We're talking about it because we know when it's stormwater from a developed land, how to address it in terms of managing the stormwater. But when it's ag field, how does the farmer have to have a contract? Do we have to identify the best practice for him? And as long as it infiltrates flow, we're fine. Or if we can divert the flow to a more natural historic pattern, which is, Ted, that sounds like something that you've been doing in the MEMF or in one of Ben's basins. So we're pulling together some assistance that'll help guide people, but I think with the idea of the gullies on ag fields, that there will be some ag money, or it'll be an ag project to address the runoff from the field, but then the gully project hopefully could then be funded through formula grants. And I'd be curious, Kent, too, the solution that's been identified in the Rock River is to put a big basin above the gully. And that seemed like it was a solution because the engineer couldn't talk about what could be done in the field. Was that the reason the gully, the basin was put in as a solution? Because it doesn't seem like a great solution.
Right. And that's kind of my point, is it gives us an opportunity to work with both agencies to come up with solutions, to come up with some guidelines, because there are many, many situations like this that need to be addressed. And so if this needs to be a pilot project, or at least have a way to get the right folks together and get some solutions on the ground, because these farmers that we've got picked out for this are excellent cooperators with their practices, and I think they're looking for an opportunity.
So have you sent this to Nina yet to ask her about the 30% designs? Can you do that yet?
We haven't
Anyway,
gotten
we can
there
talk
yet.
offline. Sorry.
We haven't gotten there yet, but now I've got this guidance, which is very valuable, that Dean has shared. And I've studied it, and I intend to do more study on it. I thought it was extremely helpful.
Yeah, no, but you can just send the 30% design for the gullies to Nina right now, because yeah, we
All
need
right.
that discussion to start as soon as possible.
I see Jim's hand.
Well, I guess I would just say, I mean, the gully restoration is it's not a rocket science. And I mean, we've used YCC in the past for many, projects like that. And I don't know what the practice is, if there is one in that manual, Dean. But I don't know what Ag Department or DEC says is acceptable, but you can certainly build check dams in gullies, and there is a lifespan, obviously, to that kind of practice. But it with the idea that it could, if it stabilizes the slope, that it could revegetate, hopefully in time. It maybe not, but I'm just saying this is, and not only that, in terms of cost per pound of phosphorus removed, it could be a very valuable project to pursue.
Yeah, I oversaw one of the projects on Crooked Creek, and if for some of you that went down to the Alair's project there, it was just above. Those were the ravines that we put the log structures in, and that could be a good area to focus on and try to replicate if we can use the formula grants for it, and we can also train a group of people to do it. It could be cheaply installed.
Right. You don't need, I mean, you certainly might need some assessment of the problem, but you don't need a design to implement this. You just need someone with some knowledge. I mean, I would think Chris Smith has probably seen this, and other people. NRCS certainly, there's a standard check dam design that's used. It's really, I mean, it was something that was used all over the US.
Dean, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess maybe maybe this can come to a close with, I'm not understanding Ken to say that the problem is the complexity of the design in the gully itself. It's just that with projects of this type, given the policy requirement to address the upstream flow, that there's more to be done. So yes, maybe the solution in the gully itself is low cost, very simple, doesn't take an engineer to design it, but that still doesn't negate the requirement for addressing the upstream contributing area. And that's where the rub is.
Well, I'd agree if you can't get it to a reforested state. I mean, maybe Karen's right. The solution is you need a detention basin or a redirection of the flow away from the point. You know, but I would say that up front, you know, that we have the digital elevation data to figure out what the drainage is. I mean, we do have very good data, especially in the Missisquoi, I believe. And so delineating the drainage areas shouldn't be that complicated. Yes, you might need a consultant to do that assessment. And then, you know, as Karen said, if the soils were, I mean, I don't know where you divert the water. If it's a cornfield, the farmer's not going to want an infiltration basin. I'm not sure what happened in that case, but diverting the water so that it isn't running over a steep eroded slope, you know, that's a common sense. That's what causes erosion. You know, getting the water just to spread out and soak in it's common sense. It's you don't need a design to figure that out. You just need to know that the water needs to go in a different direction and obviously not cause another problem. So you do need an assessment, but you don't need a design.
I'll try to end it. And Karen, as soon as LCBP releases the study with the 30% designs, we will be in touch.
Great.
Okay.
There we go.
And Karen, we'll try to make sure that the minutes say that you were shaking your head no when Jim suggested that you wanted a basin. Well, thank you all. Maybe that's our cue to start to wrap things up. And I think we're very close to that. So we've discussed our meeting schedule, so I'll be seeing folks again in a month's time. I also just wanted to mention something that many of you should have received, if not all of you, some notification from DEC regarding a QUISP and BWIC network summit. It's planned for April 5th, I believe the date is. I'm going to double check. In Waterbury, the agenda, yes, April 5th. And the agenda for that is being worked up. In fact, there's a meeting I have coming up on that. Is there anything else anyone would like to raise before the group signs off today?
When's the equinox, that what is it called? The sun, moon going over the sun, or the sun going over, moon going over the sun? Is that April 4th or 5th?
April 8th.
April 8th. Okay, we're safe. Unless the world ends.
Lauren?
Dean, could you just remind us when the next round of applications are due?
The next deadline is, hold on just a second here. It's coming up. The next deadline. Whoops, sorry. I should have, the 24th. Did everybody hear that? The 24th? Yes, sorry. I should have that burned in my brain, but I don't.
Well, it seems like maybe we're at the conclusion. We can draw this meeting to a close unless anyone has any final remarks or questions. I do want to thank everybody for getting through that really hefty agenda with good discussion, but managed to do it in 2 hours. So nicely done.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Dean.
Are
Right.
you gonna ask for a motion? Or are you gonna just declare things done?
Yeah, I guess I should officially seek a motion to
Move
close.
to adjourn.
Second.
All right, that's a motion from Lauren, a second from Alaire. All in favor, raise your hand or otherwise indicate. We've got Sarah, Lindsay, Dan, Lauren, Kent, Alaire, Ted, Julie, Barry, Beth, everybody. So thank you all and see you next month.
Bye.